Okay, good. Don't you know people don't take classes at 4:30 on Friday? I had one of my colleagues the other day saying, well, you know, you offered this class kind of late. You're probably not going to have very many students in it. And it's kind of interesting to see all you here. This is a course called Introduction to iPhone Application Development. My name is Ken Joy. People call me Ken, not Professor Joy. As I usually tell people, professors are those guys that wear tweed suits back on the East Coast and lecture at ivy-colored university, ivy-covered buildings and all. We don't do that here. This is my office. I'm over in Kemper. This is my office hours. If you want to call me, here's my email address. I usually don't put my phone number up because nobody can get me by phone. Everybody emails me. Okay, and if those times aren't good enough for you, and if you want to meet with me, we can find another time. Just email me, and we'll find a time we can meet. This is a course that came together really fast at the university. We proposed it last May, and it took a long time for them to say yes. But finally, on August 27th, 2 days before I was going to go on vacation for 2 weeks, they said, "Okay, you can do it." And we put it together really fast. It's a special topics course, because it happened so late, many of the things we hope to do, like be able to offer a bigger class, etc., haven't, and be able to offer equipment, etc., haven't come through. So we're going to have to limit this class to about 35 students, even though we're in a bigger room, because the two of us can't handle more than 35 students in a class. You're welcome to sit in and all, but there's a huge waiting list here. Not only did the class fill, by the way, in 4 hours on SysWeb, but the waiting list now is bigger than the sum of all the waiting lists in the computer science department. All right? This is on a class where they thought wouldn't have too many people in it. Okay, so what we have to say is this is a special topics class, and you're going to have to find a Mac, an Intel Mac, to run the simulator on to do the work in this class. Okay, you're going to have access to an Intel Mac. That's going to be a problem for some of you. Most of this class you're not going to have access to an iPhone because we can do almost all the stuff on the simulator. However, toward the end, right, we're going to have to somehow get access to an iPhone. Many of you have them. Many of you have Macs. I can see many of them here. This is something that will, this is something that will restrict many of you people from getting into from doing the class. Is that we have to have access to this equipment. This should be a really fun course. There's 75,000 apps I think out there now. 85,000 apps. It goes up all the time. I just found out the other day some really cool apps for young children, of which I have a young granddaughter running around my house. And, that I can get some things for her. I hadn't even thought about doing something like that. But you'll find that there's going to be a lot to learn in this course. And so somebody asked me about workload earlier, and you're going to have a lot of workload in this course because there's a lot to learn. You have to learn the development environment, Xcode. You have to learn Objective-C, right? Which for many of you is going to be some work. Once you know one language, it's not too hard to pick up the next one. Objective-C is a little funky, but it's not that bad. But you're going to have to write code in Objective-C. You're going to have to learn and use all these libraries. You're going to have to learn some OpenGL, okay? You're going to have to learn all these libraries. So there's going to be a lot of stuff in this class. However, the things you get out should be fun to do. And in that way, it should be a fun class. So any questions that you have so far? Besides, how do I get in? Okay. All right, good. I'm making sense. How far have I gone far enough? Okay, I'd like to introduce, we're going to have several guest lecturers in here who know how to work with the iPhone a hell of a lot better than I do. Okay, the first one is Serban Porumbeșcu, and Serban is someone who has come through the wars at UC Davis, He was an undergraduate here. He was an undergraduate in one of the best computer graphics class I've ever had. Okay, and I put my eyes on him at that point. And so he was an undergraduate here. He then came to continue to graduate school, and he worked in our institute and our research lab, in the computer graphics research lab. And he did some really cool stuff, kind of culminating in some things we call shell maps, which a lot of people use now, and having one of the absolute top pictures. I think it was ranked number 2 in the year. In 2005 was some of the pictures we generated with that. He then went to work for NVIDIA. He went to work for Sony, for NVIDIA, where he worked in the Apple division of NVIDIA. And now he runs his own little company, which has been doing various things, including apps. Okay? And he's going to be one of the primary lecturers. He's always wanted to kind of come back and lecture at Davis. He's going to be one of the primary lecturers here. But we're also going to, toward the end of the quarter, we're going to try to bring some people in who actually run companies in app development and things like this, and have them talk to us about how to organize things a little bit more and do things at a more higher level. So any questions before I sign off? Because I'm going to go sit in the back and watch. Any CS faculty here? Go ahead.
Because there's no website, right? Is there anything on our side?
There's a website coming. Okay. And we'll try to put everything out there we can for you. Okay. We have a Google group. We have lots of stuff for us all to talk amongst each other. Okay. So let me transfer the mic over.
Can you hear me? Okay, well, let's see. I guess I need to play with the lights here for a second. Does everyone go to sleep if I do that? All right, we'll leave that. If I hear snoring, I'll turn on the lights. But all right, well, welcome to ECS 198H. Let's see, so we've gone through some of the logistical bits about the course. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're here. And then I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of developing for the iPhone. We're going to look at a little bit of Objective-C. We're going to look at Interface Builder. We're going to build a couple of apps. And then we're going to look through some of my code just to see, here's some production code, and let's look and find the bad things that I've done, or just to see what's going on. So Ken already mentioned we need access to an Intel Mac. The iPhone or iPod Touch, again, sort of needed. We'll be able to do things on the simulator. In order to have access to the SDK through the course, you need to be enrolled in the class just because of the way Apple takes care of things. So what this will allow you to do is actually deploy your applications to an iPhone or an iPod Touch without having to pay Apple $99 a year like I have to do, and other developers. So the course info, you will find it here. Those links go to the same place. I just figured the top one is a little shorter for you to write. And this is where we will put all sorts of things, announcements, homework assignments, lectures, links to wherever. And so it was already mentioned that this course is being videotaped, and you will have access to it from some particular site, which I don't think I've ever seen, but somewhere at UC Davis you'll have access to this video. The thing that we're trying to figure out at the moment is how to get this all going on iTunes U, so that we can be up there in the iTunes world. Stanford's been up there for a while, so we need another course that does iPhone stuff up there to complement theirs. Okay, so I'm really excited there's so many people here, and one of the things I'm curious about is, why is it, why are we here? So feel free to, raise your hand or something and just let me know what it is about the iPhone or this course that sort of grabbed you. This gentleman.
People making lots of money selling apps.
Okay, so I'm actually going to go ahead and repeat a lot of things. So it's not that I'm trying to like mirror you or anything, but I'm going to repeat things just because I know I've been in these courses before where everyone's asked to use the mic and nobody ever does because we always forget to. But basically, the answer was to make lots of money because people are out there making ridiculous amounts of cash, and that's a very good reason. There's absolutely that's definitely what's drawn a lot of people. There've been a lot of rags to riches stories with people who were getting laid off. They just had 10 kids, and they made some game, and suddenly they sold 100,000 copies of it, and now they're sipping margaritas somewhere. So there are definitely a lot of those stories. Everyone's been referring to that as the gold rush, and there are a lot of people who are saying that the gold rush days are somewhat over now, which you can imagine when the iPhone first was released. There were a few hundred applications, and then quickly it grew. But the competition was different when there were 1,000 apps versus 85,000 applications. And one of the biggest problems that developers have had thus far, and I deal with it, my friends deal with it, is how is it that you get your application in front of people? So Apple has done a great job by providing the iTunes App Store, which is sort of this missing piece that other companies like, say, Palm, missed out on years ago. So you have this nice channel where you can actually have lots of eyeballs, but now that there's so many things, so many applications there, what is it that you need to do to become visible? And who knows, hopefully, I think at some point during the quarter, because it started with this, we want to make money, definitely I'm going to head over to the business school and invite some people over here at some point. And who knows, maybe a few companies will pop out of this, which would be great. Any other reasons besides making fat wads of cash that people are here? This gentleman, yes.
Give a legitimate excuse to have an iPhone or iTouch.
Okay, that's a good reason. So an excuse to actually have an iPhone or iPod Touch, which for a lot of folks in here that are students, maybe mom and dad are helping out. So this is a good way to say, hey mom, hey dad, I really I need that iPod Touch. It's not because I want to listen to music or play games. It's because I need it for homework. So that's definitely a good reason, and it sort of ties into the fact that this device is so interesting and unique. There was a quote from the Palm CEO at some point before the iPhone was released that said something along the lines of, "There is absolutely no way that Apple is going to enter this space and innovate." So clearly they did. So that's something that it's always fun when you hear people say stuff. So say stuff like that. It's very difficult to predict the future. So I don't want to make fun of this gentleman, but whenever you hear people start saying things like, "Oh, there's no way that we can do that," or that these people can do that, that's a time to really, really pay attention, because while they're busy saying it can't be done, someone's going off and doing it. All right, one more from our huge crowd here, which I wish we could let everyone in, but anyone else?
Well, I'm not a student here, I'm just sitting in, but Stanford has a pretty nice iPhone app. Stanford campus. Our unit for me, it's kind of find out what
So basically, there are a lot of uses for this device, the iPhone and iPod Touch. And from now on, I'm just going to call it an iPhone because the iPhone and iPod Touch both run iPhone OS. So when I say iPhone, it means both. So there are a lot of interesting uses for it, for individuals and for institutions like UC Davis and Stanford and a bunch of other schools. And I think a gentleman over in Marac Hall was mentioning, this is Tom Hides, was mentioning that some of the Stanford students that, I don't know if they took the first course or when it was that they took the course, they recently sold some of the stuff that they had made, which was for universities, for like $4 million. So, they're sipping margaritas somewhere, for at least for a little while. Okay, well, so why are we here? Let me tell you a little bit about why I'm here. So for me, I guess I've been self-employed for about 2 years, and I'm going to amend this story in a little bit. But for almost the last year, I've been doing iPhone stuff. So my first startup basically crashed and burned, which that's okay. That's how it goes sometimes. And I was looking for sort of the next thing to do. And I'd been keeping my eye on the iPhone for a while doing the other startup, and I thought, okay, well, this is done, so I'm just going to jump on in and start doing iPhone stuff. So for me, it was a natural transition because I've been a fan of Apple for a long time. I just like their products. I like their tools. They're not perfect by any means, and I've had my share of issues in terms of application deployment or submission to the App Store. But in general, I like their products, and I enjoy working with them. So as far as this course, for me, I guess basically, so I've been working essentially on my own for about a year, and it's really starting to get lonely. There aren't really very many iPhone developers in Davis, so I thought, all right, the only way I'm going to get iPhone developers in Davis is if I go out and start teaching some. So that's sort of a part of it. I thought, all right, let me get more involved with the university and create that community that doesn't exist yet. The other part of it is I love the fact that companies come out of UC Davis. I would really like it if there were a few more software companies that came out of here. There's all sorts of ag companies and wine making companies and medical companies and that sort of stuff. But I haven't seen very many software companies come out of here. So I think this, for me, ideally if one company came out of this, that would be fantastic. I would love it if 3 or 4 or more happened. So that's another part of it. So I mentioned that I would amend my story a little bit at the end, and so I've been self-employed for the last 2 years, but a few months ago I met with some folks at a company called Tapulous, and we sort of hit it off, and they like me, I like them. Next thing you know, I'm working for them. So actually, part of the reason this course is Monday, Fridays at these times is because I'll be in Palo Alto on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays during the week. And then to sort of minimize my driving, I'll be in Davis Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. At some point, as we progress, we could talk more about sort of kind of the indie developer life, and then maybe why is it that I decided to stop working on what I was working on and join this other company, which, by the way, their applications are on roughly 1 in 3 iPhones. So, iPhones, iPod Touches, there are about 50 million of them. So their applications are on 1 in 3 of them. So they're doing very well. And I like the stuff that they're working on. And I'll be doing graphics and game type stuff for them. So, okay, so I guess let's move on. Basically, why are we here? It's because, the iPhone is just really, really, really hot right now. And I don't know, hopefully you've all seen Zoolander and know what I'm talking about. But, yeah. So, all right, I guess with that, let's just, we're going to jump in and make a few applications just to see sort of the process. I don't expect you to absorb 100% of everything you see in the next little bit. It's going to be kind of like a hose of the information coming towards you. But it's just to get a feel for the process and a look at some of the tools that you have access to and some of the, just some of the things that you can do with them. So I will be sitting here coding, and we'll look back at that slide in a little bit. All right. Okay, so first off, this is Xcode. And basically, when you create a new project, this is what you're presented with, which is basically a set of templates that sort of get you started so you can very quickly have something up and running. Now, granted, these templates don't do very much, but they'll compile, and it'll be an application. And actually, one of these, you could probably at least when things first got started, you could essentially compile this and ship it to the store pretty easily. And basically, it was like a flashlight application. So it's just a screen, a white screen, and people would use it as a flashlight or something. I don't know. If you look on iTunes, you'll see there's tons of flashlight applications or something. But so you'll pretty much normally you'll see everything that you see here right now, except for this guy up here, which is basically something I use for doing some 2D game development, which one of the lectures we will talk about at some point for folks who are interested in possibly doing their final project as a game, as a 2D game. I'll introduce you to that stuff, which I guess we'll talk more about projects a little later. But here we go. So let's choose this template, which is a view-based application, and we'll see sort of what that means a little later. And C1. So we've got our project up and going, and right away we see that Xcode has basically generated all sorts of stuff for us, done all sorts of work, and basically one of the easiest ways to describe Xcode, besides the fact that you can edit text and code in it, is that on a certain aspect of it is a very fancy front end to, say, GCC. So all the wacky parameters that you can send to it to make it dance are hidden away in something, in these build settings, so you can sort of set various aspects of it. The other part about it is somewhat similar to make files. So I'm assuming everyone has had to use make for some sort of class or something. I see some heads shaking. So basically, we see, if you remember with make files, you have targets, and you have some files that are associated with these targets, and when some of them when the files get touched, these targets need to be rebuilt. Well, Xcode takes care of all that stuff for you, so you don't have to fiddle around with make files. Okay, so let's take a look and see what this sample first little template does for us. So that's it. You just get a screen of nothing, but it's an application. It's doing all sorts of good stuff that you didn't have to code. So let's see. Let's go ahead and try and do kind of the hello world of iPhones. So in our resources here, we have something called UCD1 viewcontroller.xib, and usually this .xib, some people have started pronouncing them .zibs. They actually refer to what's called nibs, which is basically a compact way of archiving objects. So in some of your other classes like C++ or ECS40, I think it was, you'd have a class that you created. I don't think you ever did this, but one of the things that you can do is serialize an object. So that's taking an object and somehow saving it so that at some later point, saving it to disk, some later point you can bring it back in and sort of get everything out of it and return to the state that you were in. So this is how Xcode and these Cocoa libraries, Cocoa Touch libraries, deal with saving objects. So if you remember when we ran the application, we saw something that essentially looked like this. Basically, at this point, what we're in is inside something called Interface Builder, which is where you build your GUI type stuff. So your user interface. So one of the things that's unique about Interface Builder when compared to some other tools out there is that there are other tools out there that will let you manipulate your user interface in some way. But then what ends up happening is it'll generate some code. And then if you go in and change that code and then come back into, say, this Interface Builder thing, it would then overwrite the code that you've written. So Interface Builder doesn't have that issue because it sort of hides that stuff from you in these in these .xib files, which eventually, when you compile them, will become these .nib files. But so let me get rid of this guy, and let's throw on a label. So so we have this library chooser thing where basically we have a bunch of visual elements, buttons, labels, text entry type things, and we can just drag them and throw them down, and say whatever we want to say, and we can also change various properties. So right now I have this label set up, and maybe the text is a little small, so I can go ahead and change whatever properties I need to change. I can change the text color if I wanted. And basically, so we save this, jump back over to Xcode, and build and run, and we have our application. Again, at this point, we have yet to write any code. So, it'd be nice if there was the do whatever I want template, and then you're just done. But at some point, you have to actually code, where you need some sort of input from the user, and so let's do that next. I will create a new project, and we'll take a look at. Again, we'll use this view-based application, and we'll take a closer look at some of what's going on. And how we actually interact with the code and with Interface Builder. And we'll see that for some people it's tough at first because they're just not used to it, but there's this process where you sort of bounce back and forth between Interface Builder, where you're setting up your user interface, and you come back into code and hook some, you set up some things that let you hook things up. I guess it's important to also note that you don't ever have to use Interface Builder. You can do everything that I'm doing with Interface Builder. You can do that in code, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The thing is, the more code you write, that's the more code you have to test. So for me, if a third of my application is has all sorts of visual elements to it, and if I can very quickly just lay it out and set it up without having to code, that's a huge savings. All right, so let's go again. And fire up this this thing. And actually, before I jump to this next one, I'm very quickly going to just mention this, which is a design pattern. And I don't know, I really don't know the breakdown of all the students in terms of what courses people have taken. I know the minimum requirement, at least the prerequisite, is ECS 60, so data structures. But there are these things in the software engineering world called design patterns. And basically, it's sort of like, people run into the same sort of problems over and over, or similar types of problems, and those solutions have similar answers. And design patterns kind of help you structure your solutions in certain ways based on past knowledge of how things interact in certain settings. So what we do on the iPhone is, when we structure our applications, we structure them using this design pattern that's referred to as MVC, or Model View Controller. So what that does is basically it separates various components from each other in a way that makes certain components much more reusable. So for example, models. Our models are basically just our data and the functions that interact with that data. For example, we might have a person object, and a person has a name, and a person has an age, and a person has various attributes. Maybe a person has a social security number, and a function that we might have on that person is set social security number. Well, we can protect that person by having some sort of function that when you say set social security number, if you give it a social security number that's not really a valid social security number, the person object can reject it and say, no, I don't like that. So it has the logic to sort of let things in and out, or some sort of interface to let things in and out. So if you noticed, everything I mentioned about models, it's just data. I didn't really say anything about the visual aspect of it, and that's where views come in. And views are the things that you, well, the things that you see on screen. So buttons, text things, images, and what happens is views will basically, they can look at models and display them in some way. So if you have a social security number, for example, maybe you want to display it with dashes or without dashes. The model doesn't really care how you display it or in terms of the visuals, but your view is what would sort of dictate how that looks. A good example is probably this slide right here. So there's some sort of data, some sort of model associated with this slide that tells us, the title is Model View Controller, and here's some, here's some bullet type things. And the view takes that data and says, oh, well, I have a title, and I want that title to be large, so I make it large. And it takes the bullets and says, well, I want to display bullets by having these little circles on the left-hand side, or a different view might be to have instead of the little circles, you'd have little asterisks or little pictures or something. And the third component is the controller. So basically, they're there to manage the flow of information or manage the interaction between models and views. So it's sort of the glue that connects these two things that don't know anything about each other. They don't know about their internals or how they operate. So if an event happens, so say I click on one of my views, I click on a button, that would somehow, the controller would know about that and say, oh, well, this button was clicked, and I know that when that button is clicked, I need to change this data in this model, so that would happen. So it's basically, it's a nice way of keeping things separate, and this isn't the right solution for all problems, but for a very, very, very large class of problems, this is the way to structure applications. And for those of you familiar with Ruby on Rails in web application development, they do a similar thing. They apply this model view controller. They like to, I think, they referred to it as opinionated software, where it's like, we sort of impose the architecture on you, and as long as you hang out and play nicely within this architecture, things will be fairly straightforward. As soon as you deviate and pull away from this, things get a little more difficult. So very briefly, I guess, or longer than I expected, model view controller. We're gonna know this intimately, and a number of other design patterns through as we progress through the quarter. Okay, so back to our little application here. So now, based on what we just talked about, and let me get rid of this guy. So, here's our view, this visual thing that we're seeing. So now, let's say we want to do something a little more interesting than just present a label. So let's say we want to have a button, and we want to say press me. So at this point, again, we can compile this and run it, and we can press it, and nothing will happen because we haven't really told it what to do. So what we can do now is, now we head into the actual code, and let's see how this will look here. And basically, we can hook in to that view from here. So I had a button, and so there's my little button. We'll call it a button, and we're going to learn a lot about various things that you're about to see me do. But one of the things is properties, which, if you remember from some of your programming classes, oftentimes when you have an object and you have some member variables, which in Objective-C they're referred to as instance variables, you need to access them. So you'll create something, a getter and a setter. Get a button, set a button. And you can do that in Objective-C as well directly, or you can use a feature of the language called properties, where basically it will it will generate those setters and getters for you based on these parameters that you, on some things that you set there. And we won't worry about what those mean right now, but, and I'll mention this IB outlet thing in a second. Okay, so basically what we've just said right here is create me, or I'd like to have some setters and getters for the instance variable called a button. And what we've also done is we've put this thing here called IB outlet. So IB outlet, this is the way that we're going to hook in to Interface Builder or let it know about this variable. And what happens is whenever you're inside Xcode and you're curious about what something means, there's a lot of contextual information. So, for example, you can right-click and say, jump to definition. Let's see, what is this IB outlet? And if we look, we see that it's defined to nothing. So basically, it has absolutely zero impact on our code. But what happens is Interface Builder, because these two things are so tightly coupled, as soon as we jump into Interface Builder, what we're going to see is that suddenly hello? And I don't know if we can see this closely here. Let's see. So if you see there, we now have this thing called a button, which happens to match what we had written in the code. And so this has appeared here solely because we wrote that IB outlet. So what happens now is basically outlets are pointers that let you connect your data into the view. So in this case, what I've done is I've dragged from this thing called Files Owner, which we'll learn more about what that actually is at some point in the future. But basically, for now, it's good enough to think that it refers to our to that source file that we were just in. And you see, as I drew that little path there, our outlet is this A button. So if I press that, you may have seen something going on here. Basically, what we've just done is we've connected this button to that variable. Okay, so what can we do with that now? Actually, so part of the thing is demoing things kind of as you go, as you forget some things and do them in different orders. But yes, the question.
Can you move the microphone a bit closer to you?
Move it closer?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to hear.
Oh, are you guys actually hearing me through there?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Are you supposed to?
Is this better? So I'll do better to turn this way. Does that help? And I don't know if those are actually on. Okay, I'm getting some nods that they are on. Are you hearing them? Hello, hello, hello. Okay, well, I'll just speak up. Okay. So basically, so we have this button outlet. Let's go ahead and I'm going to put in a text field as well, just to make this a little more interesting. Oops, not a text field, sorry, I meant a label. And so same thing, if we want to have access to this label in the code, we can head in here, and I'm just going to, well, okay, so I just added I added another outlet to our file. So if we jump back in here again, we should expect to see that our file's owner has this, now has access to a label. So what we should be able to do is say, okay, drag from our file's owner over to that label and say, oh, this is it right here, so make that connection. And you should have seen the connection appear there. Okay, so now let's head into, I guess, the implementation of the code. So when this template is generated, we get tons of stuff that we may or may not need. I'm just going to leave it all in there for now, but it's commented out. The first thing we'll do, in order to actually tell the compiler to go ahead and make these properties into setters and getters, we need to tell it to synthesize them. And we just do that this way. Okay, so one last thing we're going to do now, well, not quite the last thing, but basically, so we have these connections. So now we have a way of connecting to our interface, the pointers inside there. But now still, just because we press a button, we still haven't told the button to do anything. So this is where we have what's known as an IB action come into play. And this is basically going to be the event that takes place when you press the button, or the method that gets called. And so now, again, if we look at IB action, its definition is a little bit different. This one actually goes to void, which is fine for what we need. It's basically saying that this method doesn't return anything. So again, now if we jump back into Interface Builder, so outlets go from our source into the view. The way you can think about actions is that actions come out of the view and sort of point into the source. So in this case, if you noticed before, the way I was dragging is I was starting my drag on file's owner and heading over to the view. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to start in the view and drag over to the file. So we're going the opposite direction. And what should happen is we see this thing up here that says press me. So that was that action that I declared. So now we've made this connection, which if we look over to the right, basically we see that something's going on, which is, touch up inside, press me. Yes?
I see that. Is that like a prototype in C? You're working in a header file and the M is like a source code?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. So yeah, the question was, is the stuff I've been doing in this .h file, is that sort of like prototype? Or it's the declarations versus the implementations. So I'm skipping over a lot of this stuff. We're definitely, once we start really looking at Objective-C, we're going to dive in and get a better feel for how all of this kind of stuff works. Okay, so now we've made our connection, but we haven't actually done anything. We haven't said what's going to happen when this button is pressed. So, so now we're actually going to go ahead and implement this method. And for now, what we're going to do is just say nslog, which is basically we're just going to write to a log file, and we're going to say, yay. And let's just see if that hopefully all works. Okay, so we have this guy running. I'm going to bring up the console, which from this run menu, we can look at our console. And so what should be happening is nslog should be saying that something is going on, and it's not. So we have to see what's going on with that. So if we look closely, I didn't save this. So hopefully that was the issue. we'll go back and redo this. Just rebuild. And, oops. So now, hopefully, when we press that, we see that, hey, something's going on here. So what might be more interesting now is, we've connected the button, but we've also set up this outlet for a label. So what we can actually do is say, anytime the button is pressed, we can just say a label dot text equals hello again. So now what should happen is when we press, oh, I guess I already said hello again. I guess I should say something different. So that's sort of, a very, very quick, simple application, kind of going back and forth through Interface Builder and the things that we do inside of it. I think probably now, I guess we'll move on to looking at some other things. Yes?
That link, and you're going to show you that we're going to overwrite. Does that correspond to the source project?
So the question was, when I do the dragging, do the things that appear there, do they somehow correspond to the source?
Right, like this, all this is kind of like a front-end code. You then say you've got the code without the kind of basics.
Yes. So what happens is Xcode, Interface Builder, will create all the code that represents these visual elements. So if we look through our code, we don't see any of that. There are ways of accessing these properties, which you saw. I took the label, which had a member associated with it, which was called text, and I changed it to something else based on what we did. The way that Interface Builder and Xcode sort of communicate and how those things appear is through these outlets. So, I can make another one, some other label.
Are those like outlets, the copies of those outlets stored in a source file somewhere, like in the project, or like can you associate them?
Yes.
How does it generate? Where does it generate the outlets in the copies?
So, well, the thing is, the outlet has nothing to do with the code we. That IB outlet is strictly for Interface Builder to. It sort of parses the code and says, oh, this is an IB outlet, so this is of interest to me, so let me now make it available inside of Interface Builder. And then as we saw when we look at IB outlet itself, it actually is pound defined to nothing. So it does nothing in terms of the code there. But behind the scenes, there are things that are actually making these connections. So when in Interface Builder, when we drag, we're actually saying, hey, this pointer is equal to some object that's going to be created at some point.
Is there a file like where?
So you can definitely, and let's take a look real quick. So this zib, these are XML files. So let's see. Give me a sec here. Well, so there are things that you can't manipulate, because you're doing things in Interface Builder. You don't want to be able to kind of behind its back, fool it somehow, so that if when you go back in and save, it destroys what you did, or you destroy what it did in some way. So it's just you have that object and it's there. It's just it's presented to you in a very specific way where I guess you don't have access to anything.
When we do this, we get a connect statement. So we need to code that statement ourselves, or when it runs when it runs the special compiler Qt, it will generate the statement itself. That's effectively what's happening here. Is that it's doing the build, I think.
Yeah.
Right. It effectively generates that piece of code itself. We don't necessarily see that unless we want to dig whatever we do. So you can have it build it for you. Right? You don't want to touch the code because as soon as you build it again, it's going to overwrite what code, the changes to the code that you make.
So, I honestly haven't spent a lot of time digging through this, but basically, this is that zip file. So it's in some XML format, which is what what interface builders will recognize. And eventually, when you compile it, it becomes some binary, which is a .NET. So if we look, there's a bunch of keys, ID document, who knows, all this wacky stuff, which at some point, actually a lot of the things in here will make more sense to you because they are, well, some of these are like data structures that we'll be using and whatnot. Yes?
Do you recommend any books on learning Objective-C, or is it good enough to use the internet?
I'm sorry, what was the question? Are there some books on learning?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there are definitely plenty of them, and actually, that's probably a good time for me to show you more of the documentation. So I think at some point I'll put on the website a list of potential books that you can use. The thing is, Xcode has fantastic documentation. So if you go up to the help and look at developer documentation, you're going to get tons of stuff, so you can see the last thing I was looking at was something related to Shark and Symbolicate, which at some point that'll make sense to you in the future. But for now, if you just head home, and I have a bunch of different things here, but let's say the iPhone OS library, this is, you have tons and tons of stuff, and I don't know how easy it is for you guys to read there, but various things on all the frameworks, OpenGLES, audio-related things, core animation, core location. These are, a lot of these things are things we're going to be discussing. And then one of the more important ones is this getting started, where basically, you see they've got this learning Objective-C, a primer, so that'll be something good to look at some point, an overview of the operating of the iPhone OS, and just the general tools and things. So there's a ton of documentation, and you could spend a lot of time actually just like reading through all this stuff and never getting to coding, but hopefully you don't. Yes?
Is all this documentation and iPhone stuff part of Xcode, or do you need to get it separately?
It is all inside of Xcode. You can actually access it outside of Xcode on Apple's website. But if you saw when I jumped to it, it was help, developer documentation, and there we are. There are other ways. So for example, maybe I really want to know more about a label. What is it that I can do with a label? Well, what you can do is there's some key combinations which you'll learn eventually. But you see, if I press this, this guy turns into a crosshair, and you can double click on it, and it'll show you some contextual or some information based on that. And maybe this is enough of what you needed to see, and maybe not. If it's not, then you can expand and jump into here. Now we can see everything we want to see about labels. So tasks. What are the things that that we can do with labels? Well, we can play with text and their font and their color and all sorts of other things. And yeah.
I guess I should have clarified what I know was, should I go home tonight and start Xcode on my computer and be able to get to those things?
Yes, you can. Yes. So basically, everyone in here can go to, and maybe we should just do that and see. Oh, I don't have web access here. Sorry. But basically, if you join the iPhone developer program, which eventually folks that are in the class are going to get an invitation, which I think you'll still need to create some sort of login thing with Apple, but basically you'll be able to have access to the software development kit and install Xcode and get to everything. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to looking at, let's look at a project that I've worked on and see what we can see from it. So I'll build and run it real quick and see. So basically, this is an application called Scrabby, the Scrabble word solver. And basically what it does is you enter some letters. It's a Scrabble cheater. That's the easiest way to describe it. You enter some letters, and question marks represent spaces. That's the Scrabble notation for spaces. And you search, and it generates all the words. And and in this case, the lowercase notation is the representation of that question mark. So it says that the lowercase letter came from a question mark. So this is an application that I have in the App Store right now, yeah, it's the funny thing is I probably spent maybe initially I did this app as a toy. I was like, let me just go through the entire process of deploying to the App Store and seeing what it's about, and I'll put it up there for free. I had so many downloads for it that I thought, wow, I should be charging for this. So I started charging for it, and that's so this pays some of the bills every month. So which also Hasbro didn't really like it, and they threatened to sue me, and that's another story for some other time. But I have lots of nice people helping me out with that, so it's okay. Okay, so the thing I wanted to show you was. Or the next thing is some of the other tools you have at your disposal that will sort of help you find bugs in your code. And as of Xcode 3.2, which is what we'll be using in this class, which comes as part of the software development kit, you have what's called a static analyzer. So before you even run your code, this thing will go through and tell you, oh, you're doing something bad here, or I think you're doing something bad here. And it's not going to catch everything, but it does a pretty decent job of catching some things. So one of the things that it's pretty good at is catching memory leaks, and that's one of the aspects of Objective-C that is sort of tough for folks at first. But I think coming from a C and C++ background, it's easier because you're already used to that memory management of allocating stuff and freeing stuff. It's sort of a similar scenario here, except you use something referred to as reference counting. So when your reference to something goes to 0, it gets deallocated for you. But we'll look at that. So let's analyze my code and see what we see. So I did this earlier this morning, and I thought, oh, let me just check, because this tool wasn't available the first time I deployed to the App Store. And I thought, my code is awesome. I don't have any memory leaks. I don't have anything. And so once you compile, if you look in the lower right corner, you'll see like a weird little blue thing there. So that's the icon that tells you, okay, something's going on. There's two things of interest. So this thing is telling me, basically, you are potentially leaking memory in these two locations. And when it first told me that earlier today, I was like, no way, come on. So what's interesting, though, is if you start looking at them a little closer, Xcode starts to do some other more interesting things for you, which is, it starts drawing these little graphs and things, and you can kind of see what's going on. So it's basically saying, okay, I've entered this method, I'm doing some things, and I end up doing here, this is how you would allocate an image. So I'm allocating some image and initializing it with something. And what happens when you do this sort of allocation, you have to make sure that you free it at some point. And if we look through my code, well, it's basically saying, well, I got here to the end, and these guys were not freed. So I found two memory leaks in my shipping product, which at the end of the day, for this particular thing, everyone, you're going to ship with bugs because that's just how it happens. It turns out that in this case, that code happens to be here on this screen, which, based on my analytics, hardly anyone ever goes to. So this thing isn't going to crash your iPhone, not on this screen, but I will fix it in the future. So that's one of the tools. Another tool that we'll be using is called Instruments, and I'm actually going to go back to one of the other ones that we just worked on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce some memory leaks. So basically, I'm going to allocate an array. Now let's do a mutable array. And we're going to be learning about all the containers and data structures for this stuff soon enough. So this is basically saying I have an array that's mutable. So basically, I can change things. I can continue to add or delete objects versus a fixed size array, which I can't. So we'll just call it A. And what you can then do is say ns mutable array alloc. So this is how we allocate. And you can sort of think of this as calling a constructor, except it's done in 2 steps. So the first step is you allocate, and then you sort of call something to initialize that memory. And in this case, we'll init, and actually, so another nice thing is, as you're typing these things, Xcode is sort of a step or 2 ahead of you in trying to figure out where you're going. So at this point, I don't know what all the different initialization functions are, so I start typing them, and it sort of fills the one it thinks that I'm likely to want to use. And if you hit escape, you get this contextual menu where you can see all the different sort of things that you could possibly initialize with. In this case, I do want to init with capacity, and let's initialize with 100 locations in this array. And we're not really going to do anything with it except allocate it and look at one of our tools here. So again, one of the tools that we'll be learning is called Instruments, which will let us look at CPU usage, memory usage. In this case, we're going to look at memory leaks. So we head down and say, okay, let's look at leaks. And Instruments is going to fire up, and our application will fire up. And what's happening now is Instruments is running. It's looking at the objects being allocated. So there were a bunch allocated at the beginning, and then there's some sort of leaks. And it's strange that it already found some because I didn't press anything. But what should happen is now if we look, oops. Basically, we get the stack trace of what's going on, and you see, over time, something was going on, and there was some sort of leak was detected. And what we can do is, basically, we can isolate that thing and window it in some way, and maybe put something else over there, and sort of limit what we're looking at. It's not really filtering much here, but basically, you can, you have this information over time, and then you can window it and focus on some specific area. In this case, it says that there's something going on, and I happen to know what that problem is, but so the idea here is then to kind of, we would look through this data and find out that, something is leaking somewhere. And there was some weird bug earlier today where it wasn't showing me some things that I wanted to see, and I don't know if that's happening right now. But in the interest of time, I'll just, because I'm not seeing it, we'll skip it and know that, at some point we're going to come back to Instruments, and it's going to be able to tell us some things about memory leaks, for example. The last thing I'll do is I'll show you one more application where, again, we'll use Instruments, but this time we'll take a look at Well, actually, no. This time we're not going to use instruments. We're going to use something called Shark. And I won't run it because it takes a while to run. And what I've actually done is I ran this ahead of time. And it's even going to take it a little bit of time to load up. And while it does that, we will look at the application that that we're going to look at the data for. So Shark is another performance analysis tool it's different from instruments in a few ways. It basically gives you much more detailed information. It can even give you information about cache hits and misses, for example, or pipeline stalls in your code. So in this case, the application that we're looking at is this is just like a demo thing where I was working on some dynamically generated geometry. And what happens is we see here that it says that it's running at roughly 50-something frames a second, which I don't believe it, but for various reasons. But basically, if it's running this fast on this machine, and it's not 60 frames a second, it's running super dirt slow on my iPhone, or 12 frames a second, for example. So let's pause that, see if it goes. Yeah. So yeah, again, this particular app, what I was doing is I was working on what will eventually be a lava lamp simulation, and I needed something where these little blobby things kind of move together and interact and grow and stuff. And then here I did a very cheesy environment mapping to try to make it look shiny, and it's cheesy because it's incorrect. I did some hack to do it, but it was good enough for what I was trying to see. And unfortunately, I ran into performance issues, and basically, Shark is sort of the place to look to kind of see what's going on, because for whatever reason, instruments wasn't really showing me what I needed to see, for example. So again, in this case, Shark samples your application and sort of, makes a note of what's happening where. And in this case, if we look, we see that, 99% of the time is spent in Goo, which is my application. So that's good. At least it's spending time in my stuff and not somebody else's stuff. So if we head on down and expand this a bit, we see that this thing that's taking 99% of the time is split up into these two things. One of them is taking 63%, and the other one is taking 35%. So I have this update scene and render scene. So update scene is what's actually going through and saying, hey, blobby thing, move, generate geometry, and then after that, I have this other thing which says, okay, take that geometry and render it in some way. So if we look here at update scene, we now see some more children of that particular thing. And in this case, we see we've got something that takes 47% of the time, and then a bunch of other things that take less time. So, okay, find transverse cells, whatever that might mean, seems to be taking up a lot of time. So again, we drill down into it, and again, we see more things. This time, they're getting more spread out. So now we've got 22% of the time being spent somewhere, with the remaining 20-something, 25% being spent in all these other places. So if we look now in this add grid cell, what eventually we'll find is operator new. So one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is that just because we're using Objective-C doesn't mean you don't get to use C++ and all the wonderful things that you've learned before. You can actually use something called Objective-C++, which I make lots of use of. And this actual code here is all C++. And I had my reasons for doing that. And imagine there's some open source library that you really want to use. Chances are it's not in Objective-C, but it's in C++ or C. So it's fairly easy to integrate in, and we'll look at how to actually do that in the future. So in this case, basically my problem seems to be, at least here, that I'm allocating memory way too much. So using Shark, I was able to kind of get here and see, okay, I'm doing something wrong. I need to come up with some more interesting memory allocation strategy, which initially I thought I had taken care of, and for whatever reason, Instruments wasn't showing me that that I had. And eventually, once I looked at Shark, it showed me, okay, I missed something. And unfortunately, this problem is kind of hard to solve because of the way I architected this. So that's why I put this on hold, and that's when I made Scrabby and various other things. So I think, that's probably, in terms of running through all the applications, that's where I'll leave it right now. Next time, we're going to actually start looking at Objective-C and the syntax, and we're going to move through it pretty quickly because you guys already know object-oriented programming and you already know C++, so the syntax isn't that wacky. I mean, maybe it was, but so one last thing.
Oh, something really important.
Yeah, one last thing. So we didn't really mention anything about assignments, but there were a few folks who asked at the beginning, but I'll just repeat it now. We're probably going to have, we're going to have at least 5 assignments, and they're going to build up, basically, learn to walk, learn to crawl and learn to walk with all the tools. Eventually, we're going to get to the final project, which is going to be a 4-week project. This is going to be a larger project than what a lot of you are probably used to in school right now. And that project you'll be able to work on alone or with a partner. And the goal is, at the very end, and I'm not going to force you to do this, but at the very end of the course, if you so choose to press submit, you'll be able to send it off into the App Store. So that's kind of where we're headed. Tons and tons of stuff. Hopefully this didn't scare you off, that it was kind of all over the place, but just, you now have a feel for some of the tools, and we have tons and tons of stuff to learn and do, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So hopefully.
One very important thing, though, is that there's not going to be class next week.
That's a very important one.
That's a very important one. Don't show up Monday. Right? He's got a job to do. I've got a job to do. There's not going to be class next week. We're going to jump into this a week from Monday. Okay. So go check out some C++, Objective-C books. Get ready. And we'll kick off.
Yeah. So jump on the site later. By tomorrow, I'll have some lists of things for you guys to read.